Hi, my name is Oliver Burt Pollak. I was born in London on November the 10th, 1943. The reason I was in London is that my parents had fled from Nazi, the Nazis and Hitler. My mother lived in Hanover in Germany, and she got out of Germany after Kristallnacht and went to England. And my mother's name, by the way, is Ruth Bachman, Bachman, double N. And her father had been a physician in Germany. And my father lived in Vienna, and his name was William, or it was Wilhelm then. And he left Austria after the Nazi Anschluss, and he served in the Czech Brigade of the British Army, and he spent some time in Palestine, some time on the continent of Europe in France before the Germans took over France, and then he served in England in the Czech Brigade. My father was born in 1903, so that when he went into the English Army, he was sort of at advanced age for being a private in the Army. And my mother and father met in England, and they got married, and I am one of the results. I have a younger sister, Judy, or Judith, Agnes Pollak, and she was born in 1950 in London. I've always thought that my first name, Oliver, derived somewhat from Oliver Cromwell, who, when he was leader of the Commonwealth in England in the 1640s and 1650s, permitted the Jews to come back officially to England. The Jews had been expelled in the 13th century. Although my parents, my mother, my father of blessed memory, died in the late 1970s, my mother can't confirm that I'm Oliver because of Oliver Cromwell. All she will tell me is, if you were a girl, you would have been Olivia. My middle name is Bert because my paternal grandfather in Austria was Adalbert, and so that got anglicized to Bert, and I still can't figure out whether it's B-E-R-T or B-U-R-T. Probably have a minor crisis when it comes time to get my retirement from Social Security. There's some discrepancy there. My sister's middle name is Agnes, and that is my paternal grandmother's first name, Agnes. While my mother and my father managed to escape Germany and escape Austria, that wasn't the case with the rest of the family. On my father's side, the Austrian Viennese Jews were rounded up in the summer of 1942 and sent to various camps. My grandmother, Agnes, was sent to Terezin. She was rather elderly. She was in her 70s, and she had a heart condition, and she died within 2 weeks of arriving in Terezin. And Terezin was the model concentration camp. My mother's father, Felix Bachmann, who was born in 1881 and had earned his medical degree at University of Kiel, K-I-E-L, in 1907, was a great lover of Germany, and the only thing I think that identified him as Jewish was his birth certificate. And it says Jüdische on the birth certificate. I have the birth certificate. And his wife left Germany, his daughters left Germany, but he wasn't going to leave Germany because he thought Hitler was an aberration and that German people would come to their senses and he would be toppled and life would get back to German culture and cosmopolitanism. And I think my grandfather used to say that he would be on the last train out of Germany, and to a certain degree he was correct, that the train went in the wrong direction. he went to Terezin as well. My grandfather had fought in the First World War on the German side as a surgeon and had been injured, had taken some shrapnel in his arm and in his shoulder, and basically lost the surgical fine motor skills in his right arm. So he still practiced medicine, but mostly after 1918 as an examiner for disability cases. He was an injured, disabled war veteran. So when Hitler came to power, one of the first things he did after assuming power in 1933 was in 1934 they awarded the German troops a medal. One of the things that Hitler was propped up by was his sense that the Germans had been stabbed in the back and the veterans hadn't been given their due. So they were all, many of the veterans were given the Ehrenkreuz for Frontkämpfer, the Honor Cross for frontline warriors. So it looks like an Iron Cross. My grandfather got that in 1934. The following year, in 1935, the Nuremberg laws came out and my grandfather lost his job, but as a working for the civil service as a medical examiner, but he still was getting his disability pension. The Germans, even the Nazis, were somewhat loath to deal harshly with bemedaled First World War I Jewish war veterans. In any case, his number is up, and he's called to Terezin in July of 1942, and he endures that until liberation of May of 1945, and he survived Terezin, in the process of which he wrote a report, medical report, on the camp, the model camp. And I've written a great deal about my grandfather based on the reports, the records that he kept, and his life in literature is quite vital. The story about his diary or his report, and then my seeing some traces of Terezin when I was in Florence became an article, and I think the major article is being reprinted by Yivo, and later this year Creighton Magazine is doing another version of my grandfather's story. So I'm not saying that this is a minor industry or that this is professionalizing the Holocaust, but as a historian I come to this material with a methodology of how to transform it into a story, and I come to it as it's part of my family. So I was born to give that as a background, and I was born in 1943. Germany was bombing England. I have recollections of holes in the ground where the V-2 and the buzz bomb rockets landed. I have recollections of just bombed out and shelled out buildings. My mother and I were sent to Stoke-on-Trent out of harm's way. A lot of children and mothers were sent to Canada to keep them out of harm's way. We didn't get across the ocean, but we weren't part of the kinder transport, but we went up to Stoke-on-Trent. My earliest memory, it's hard to identify, but I sort of remember picking mushrooms in Richmond. I sort of remember my grandmother cutting tapers from Rice Krispies boxes so she could use those tapers to light the fire. And I sort of remember an Easter egg hunt. And this is probably in my age somewhere between 3 and 7 years of age. I remember having my tonsils taken out under national health in England, and a great part of that, I think, was 6 years old. We got ice cream afterwards. There wasn't anything particularly Jewish in my upbringing in England. We lived in a house that was, my father called it a kibble, which is I think, German for bucket or dump, and the place leaked, and we had one bathroom, which they had to share with 3 other families. And he had a fairly good job, but the goal was to emigrate, and the choices were South Africa, probably Johannesburg, where we knew some people, Australia, where we knew some people, or United States, where we knew far more people than South Africa or Australia. And thankfully we came to United States. Uh, one of I do remember entering a synagogue at least once in England. I can still sort of recall the architecture in the doorway. My parents sent me to a school called St. Saviour's School. It was a pretty good school. I remember it was so huge, and I revisited it about a year and a half ago when I went to London, and it wasn't large at all. It's just the perspective of a child in a large building and the perspective of an adult being surprised by how small it was. But the real point here is uh, it was an Anglican school, and we had to pray and get on our knees. And I think I asked my mother for a note saying that I didn't have to do that, and I don't think the note was forthcoming. Uh, Apparently, from my father's account, there was a gentleman in a family in the house named Novak, Christians, and he, Mr. Novak, I think, had called my mother a dirty Jew. My father socked Mr. Novak and then was hauled up in front of a magistrate's court and given a fine. I hope it was a nominal fine. It was an assault, but uh, everything. Anyway, my father paid the fine and didn't go to jail. Uh, so going to America was a goal. On my father's side, his sisters had emigrated to America in the 1930s, and they had a couple of jewelry stores, small mama-papa operations, so they were in New York. And my grandfather, who survived Terezin, emigrated to America and got a job in a town called McConnellsville at a tuberculosis sanitarium. Ohio had a couple of things going for it. I believe it's one of the few states in the United States where a doctor back then did not have to be an American citizen. And plus, tuberculosis sanitariums didn't involve anything invasive on the part of the physician. It involved therapy, sunshine, medication, and he could accomplish that with his arm in the condition it was in. So when he got this job in McConnellsville, ultimately we emigrated to America in November of 1952 and spent a few days in New York. It was November of 1942, and we crossed the North Atlantic in a ship called the Liberté, a French liner. And it was a huge ship, probably the fourth largest passenger ship in the world. But even a huge ship in a North Atlantic gale in November is just not very comfortable. I can remember the ship going back and forth and things flying off and sliding off of tables. And I can remember my father literally green. And here I was 8 years old, and it didn't seem to affect me at all. I was just, had these sailor's legs. And anyway, we arrived in New York, and my uncles and aunts actually saw my sailor's legs because I arrived in New York in November, very cold, and I was wearing an English schoolboy's outfit. I was wearing shorts. And apparently I was rather spindly, and they sort of, or somebody mentioned that you look like a Korean War orphan refugee. So they quickly got me a pair of jeans. We had Thanksgiving dinner with my uncles and aunts in New York. And one of my memories for that when I was 8 years old was one of my aunts was using a pressure cooker. I swear my memory is that the turkey landed up on the ceiling because something went wrong with the pressure cooker. I've been averse to pressure cookers ever since. We moved to McConnellsville, and I guess I was in the 4th and 5th grade there. And I've been wanting to go back to McConnellsville for about 3 or 4 years. And I sort of said, Karen, why don't we drive out to McConnellsville on a 4th of July weekend? We'll get 3 or 4 days. We'll drive out to Ohio. It's in southern part of Ohio. It's on the Muskingum River. And she was reluctant to do that. Well, we celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary a couple of months ago, and her surprise present to me was a long Memorial Day weekend in McConnellsville. So end of May of 2001, we flew to Columbus, rented a car, and went to McConnellsville. And it was a gas, so it was great. When we were living there, there were 2,400 people, and now there are 1,400 people. It's a story of many small towns in Ohio and in Nebraska. Uh, we walked around, saw my old house, couldn't find my grade school, and that justified the validity of my memory. It had burnt down. It wasn't there anymore. We went up to where my grandfather had been working at the tuberculosis sanitarium, a place called Rocky Glen Sanitarium. It was still there, but now it's an old age home. They don't have tuberculosis sanitariums anymore. We went to the movie house, which I recalled paying 9 or 10 cents for a ticket and seeing a double bill with a serial. And it was still there, called the Opera House, but now it's being run by a non-profit corporation. The Bluebell Diner was still there. Central Market was still there, founded in 1934. My mother said her grandfather Felix, gave her $6 to go shopping, and she could buy so much food with $6 she didn't know how to get the food back to the house. Well, fortunately, the house is only 4 or 5 blocks away, but the abundance of food in America compared to rationing in England was phenomenal. Just to backtrack, we left England in November of '52, and England was on rationing. That meant we dealt in the black market for things like cod liver oil, so I wouldn't get bow-legged, and eggs, and meat that looked like meat. But when we got to America, there was no black market. All this stuff was readily available. One of my father's sort of pie-in-the-sky dreams was when he got to America, he would have a pound of bacon for breakfast every day. And I'm inserting these, the bacon and the Easter eggs and other aspects to show, I guess, that we weren't very Jewish, although we were labeled or targeted as being Jews. It's good to know that when we got to America, he didn't live up to the pound of bacon every day. It would not have been good for him, but it was available if he wanted it. Again, getting back to the May 2001, we were there, and the Ben Franklin 5 and Dime wasn't there anymore. There was a furniture store, and we just walked around town. There was a Memorial Day parade. It was also high school graduation weekend, so it was pretty busy for a town that was very sleepy. But I spent 2 years there, and there was another Dr. Bachman there, strangely enough, Henry Bachman, but he only had one N, and he was Jewish, and he had come over from Germany to America in 1937 and had been a general practitioner in McConnellsville. He died, but his widow was still there, and we took a picture of her with my wife Karen, sent that to my mother, and she remembered my grandfather from the late 40s, early 50s. We left Ohio, left McConnellsville in 1955. My grandfather had retired, and we moved to California, moved to Los Angeles, where my grandfather's other daughter, Renee, lived. And then my grandfather died of a heart attack while on vacation in Palm Springs in 1956. All the time he'd been receiving his disabled veterans pension. He'd been receiving basically his Social Security pension, and he'd been receiving his reparations payments from the German government for being dispossessed by Nazi policy. So it was a comfortable life, and he didn't have any great financial needs, and it was comfortable. I went to Hebrew school when we got to Los Angeles. There was no chance of going to Hebrew school in McConnellsville, even if my parents had thought about it. And I think they probably had thought about it. McConnellsville it was just hot and muggy, and as far as I can tell, air conditioning hadn't been invented yet. We got to California, and I was sent off to a Hebrew school. I guess I was 11 years old, a little bit late to be starting Hebrew school. I don't know whether I would have done any better if I had started earlier. I don't have a good facility with language. I can prove that by the fact that I've studied French, German, Russian, Spanish, Latin, and a year of language study in London doing Burmese. I'm proud of the way I can almost manage to use English, and I hire translators when I need to. Not for English, though. So I had a bar mitzvah. I was a little bit older than 13 when that came off. My grandfather had died, and I remember my grandfather's funeral. To back up, the funeral was in Hollywood, and I remember the sort of sermon, or well, I guess it would be a sermon that the rabbi gave. And I recently found that sermon printed in a book of sermons for bereavement. I said, oh, I know this one. So, as a professional historian, I've spent most of my time writing about things that I was interested in, but had nothing to do with me. Books on South Africa, books on Burma, 100 articles, professional articles on a variety of topics. But when I came to Omaha, I started to refocus a little bit. I think a couple of things caused that refocusing. Number one, when we went house hunting, as I recall, the multi-listings of the real estate agents identified areas by parishes. And I said, oh, well, I don't think that's going to be helpful for us. And then we had children, Aaron and Noah, and so some primordial gene swelled up, and we started thinking more and more Jewishly. The kids went to the Jewish day school, and I started focusing the method of writing history, the method of collecting evidence, the method of preparing printed texts for a wider public. I started focusing that into Jewish history, and sort of an opportunist, sort of a chameleon, that wherever I live, I'm going to try to find the path of least resistance to acquire material. When I taught from 1970 to 1973 at the University of Rhodesia, which is now called University of Zimbabwe, and we lived in Salisbury, which is now called Harare. And I wasn't trained as an African historian, but I was trained as a historian, and the archives were about a 10-minute ride from my house on a bicycle. And I went to the archives and quickly got invested or involved in writing about African labor. And that turned out to be quite an interesting project, and my wife and I collaborated on a couple of reference books about Southern Africa. The method of doing history is more important than the subject that you write about. You find a subject, the method comes to play. So in Omaha, I put another arrow in my quiver, and that was American Jewish history, and closer to home, Nebraska Jewish history. I'm very pleased to use this as a promotional moment. My book, Jewish Life in Omaha and Lincoln, a photographic history, will appear around Thanksgiving of this year, 2001. You can buy it at your local bookstore for $19.99 and be published by Arcadia Press. And the way I got to write that is, again, in 1982, Mary Fellman approached me and said, "You're a nice boy, Oliver. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." And Mary and I hit it off, and we sort of collaborated. I was the professional scholar, the academic who had the method, and Mary had the energy, the will, the desire, the vision, and knew where to find the money. And we didn't take a lot of money, but it takes more and more money as we go along. And that was in 1982 with Sylvia Rothman and Joey Simon. And By then I was a fledgling lawyer, I also created a nonprofit corporation for the Nebraska Jewish Historical Society, and that's grown from a not much more than a closet to quite an operation. And in the process of that growth, they acquired several thousand photographs, and time came up that somebody said, does anybody know anybody that could put together a book on Jewish life in Omaha? I got that email, and I said, I guess I'm that person. So that's how I've spent the first half of the year 2001 putting that book together. My interest in Jewish history is also a case of testing methodology and retaining objectivity so that what I prepare, what I write, won't necessarily be biased or criticized for being nostalgic or being what's called patristic or hagiography. The book that I showed you earlier that I'm reading, The Galleys, it's called A Year at the Sorbonne, and the publisher asked, Oliver, would you be interested in writing about my brother, Elmo Shaver? And Elmo had left 63 years of diaries, and Neil Shaver had them all. I think I have some over there right now. And that's about 23,000 entries from 1932 to his death in 1995. And I basically said, Neil, I'll look at them, and if there's something Jewish in them, I'll give it a shot. Well, it turns out that it didn't take any x-rays or any special interpretation to see a Jewish theme in this two-thirds of a century of diaries. It was lying right there. Elmo Shaver was a Judeophile, or a Philo-Semite, and for a number of reasons he came to that position, although he started out as a position that probably was marginally antagonistic to Jews, and then he became fascinated by Jews, and then the books he read were out of proportion written by Jewish writers, or the storyline was written by Gentiles, but the storyline was Jewish. Well, what I'm getting at is, if the diaries had been diaries without a Jewish dimension, there would have had to be something very interesting in the diaries and very interesting in his life for me to have pursued it. But what it turns out to be that is he's a gay Christian Science French professor who is fascinated by Jews. I don't know whether the gay Christian Science French professor by itself would have been enough to sustain my interest, but the fact that he read about Jews and wrote the books the titles and the authors of the books he read down in his diary, that sustained me. That book's coming out. It's not going to be $19.99. No, that's going to be about $120 because it's a limited edition of 150 volumes, 150 copies. Signed and numbered, though. Okay, so we're in McConnellsville. We've just moved to California, and I went to junior high school at Audubon Junior High School, and then to high school at Susan Dorsey High School. I joined AZA, and I became familiar with the names Henry Monsky and Philip Klutznick. I guess it would be the late 1950s. And I have one friend that I retain from high school. His name is Nathan Bassing, and he was the president of the AZA. I was the man behind the scenes, or the person behind the scenes that helped get him elected. And we had lost track of each other in the late 60s when he went in the Army to Vietnam and I was in the Navy in Vietnam. But thanks to the internet and computerized library catalogs, he figured out where Karen and I lived about 4 years ago, and we've been in contact ever since. He's visited here. I visited him in Las Vegas, and on a dare, we decided to go to our high school 40th high school reunion in October of 2000. But we've had a water break, and we're carrying water around now in plastic vials, which we didn't do several years ago. And I think where we left off, I was talking about AZA and my early teenage years in Los Angeles, riding bicycles, learning to drive a car. One car in the family, so if I wanted to use the car, my father was sort of a workaholic. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning, drive him to work so he could be there at 5, and then he had to be picked up in the evening as well. And my high school career was undistinguished, perhaps forgettable, with the exception that although I took an academic course, geometry, trigonometry, French, and Spanish, I had a craving for reading. I read not just what was assigned, but I read for pleasure. I can remember going to the library at Leimert Park on my bicycle, checking out books, and reading was important. And I can remember some of the books I read. But as far as grades and academic achievements in high school, not to be talked much about. Ironically, when my elder son Noah graduated from Millard North, he went to University of Kansas in Lawrence, and I don't think Noah was all that happy with going to high school, but he maybe didn't know it that well. But when he got to college as a freshman, he said, "Dad, if I knew how much fun college was going to be, I would have skipped high school." It's a little bit of an echo. Maybe we're late bloomers, so to of a fashion. Anyway, so I did graduate high school on time. That wasn't a problem. The school I went to was, we would use the word today, diversity. We'd say back then it was very racially mixed. About a third white, a third African American, although we would have said Negro back then, and a third Asian, Chinese and Japanese. And there was a statement, whether you eat beans, greens, or rice, you are all Dorseyites. I think it was probably making a virtue of necessity. But it was a good high school experience. And when I graduated, my parents wanted me to go to UCLA, and either because I didn't have the grades or out of revolt against my parents, I went to California State College in East Los Angeles. Big campus, commuter campus. Would drive there every day. And I ended up being a social science major. About my second or third year, I couldn't figure out whether it was pre-law or what. But I realized that with all my economics and sociology and psychology and anthropology, if I fitted them in right, I would complete my social science major and get out of college in 3.5 years, which getting out sooner than later was an advantage. Now, in the summer before I went to college, I joined the Navy. I joined the Naval Reserve, much against my father and mother's wishes, but they didn't hold me back, and I went to boot camp in the summer of '61 in San Diego, and fairly vivid recollections of boot camp. And then when boot camp was over, school start, and I would get a Navy Reserve check. We had monthly meetings, weekend warriors, and that money was always helpful to buy books or pay tuition or have fun. Spent 3.5 years at Cal State LA. I can still remember some of the professors by name. It was a state college. The highest degree they offered was a master's degree, so the faculty did not have a high research profile, but it was workmanlike, and it was a workman's school. Looking back on it, it was It was a workmanlike. It wasn't a stellar institution like UCLA or Berkeley. It's 1965. I graduate, and a couple months before graduation, well, a little bit before graduation, I met a young man named Burl Weiner, and we seemed to hit it off. He was at UCLA, and he was pre-law, and we've become very good friends, and we're still friends today. And so we were palling around, and I was studying at the UCLA library in the basement, and I met Karen, my wife, Karen Goldstein then, and she and my friend Burl had been to high school together, so we went out for drinks. You could drink at 18 then, you did not have to be 21. And ends up, he is the best man at my wedding, and I'm the best man at his first wedding. And we're still in touch with his first wife, and who lives in Memphis. And so when it's 1965, I've met my bride and wife-to-be in a library. She didn't go to UCLA either. She actually went to Cal State LA. But meeting in the library probably was not semi-prophetic, but it was important for things to come, using hindsight. We both like to read. I like to read much more than she does. Or let's put it differently, I finish the books I start, and that's no criticism of her. She starts more books than I do. But we encourage each other to read, and we share readings. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were in Southern Africa, we put together, I think it was 3 books. She proofreads everything I write, and she is not to be ignored, and fortunately her handwriting is good. And while I can write a sentence and get my thoughts out, I may not get the commas or the spelling or the syntax correct. Karen doesn't write, but she can edit, and those are 2 skills that work out quite well. And I'm forever thanking her in introductions and in acknowledgments and dedicating works to her. Well, again, to get back to 1965, I was in the reserves, and the chicken came home to roost, or the egg got laid. Vietnam is bubbling and starting to boil over, and President Johnson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had this major build-up, and they had to beef up the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marine Corps. And here I was, tootling along through my undergraduate years, getting my deferments, getting my weekend warrior pay, and then I got the message that I was being called up for active service. As much as I tried to get out of active service, like saying I wanted to go to graduate school, they said, well, you can go to graduate school when you're discharged. I had no thoughts of protesting the war or going off to Canada, although I had colleagues, friends that did do that. And I was called up and put in 1965, June or July 65, I think it was, onto a landing ship tank, the USS Sumner County, LST 1148, a flat-bottom boat that crossed the Pacific at a top speed of 12 knots. Now, when I was 8 years old crossing the North Atlantic in a gale, I had no problem with being at sea. I had no sense of seasickness, no disorientation, no nausea. And I must tell you that for 2 years in the Navy, 1965 to 67, I was virtually seasick or in marginal remission for the entire 2 years. I hardly read at all for 2 years. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't focus. I got my work done. I did what needed to be done when I was in the service. And I had a reading list that I had taken with me from college of things I wanted to read. And I actually owned the books, but I just couldn't concentrate. The ship flopping around just was a problem. So we made, I think, went to Vietnam twice on this ship via Hawaii, via the Philippines, via Japan, and then landing troops, soap, beer, soda pop, jeeps on Vietnam's coast, and then pulling off the beach. And then I came back and I asked Karen to marry me, and she didn't say no, and we got married at a synagogue in Los Angeles. And then I went back to sea and for a second trip to Vietnam. And one of my shipmates, Reginald Leroy Truman, we shared an office on board ship, and then we lost contact after we both got discharged in '67, recently found me through the World Wide Web about 2.5 years ago, and he has visited us in Omaha, and we have visited him and his wife, his second wife, in Los Angeles. His first wife was a woman named Pat Potts, and she was a high school classmate of mine, so we had some tie there, but they got divorced. His second wife, Reg, is African American. His second wife is Jewish, and both his daughters have been bat mitzvahed, and Reg recently converted to Judaism. And as I say, he found me about 3 years ago, and we've been nattering back and forth. He has sort of an idée fixe on his, I think he thinks the greatest years of his life were when he was in the service, and my recollection, as with high school, is those were 3 years in high school that could have been omitted, 2 years in the service that could have been omitted. Nonetheless, I recognize that those 3 and 2 year periods are important in fashioning how one thinks, what one's interested in, what one isn't interested in, just as the early years of upbringing leave an imprint. Reg, I think he liked wearing a uniform, and he wanted to be a police officer when he got out, and he didn't become a police officer, but he became a reserve police officer. But I think he sells insurance, and maybe the uniform and carrying a gun had greater allure. Not for me, but for him, but that's okay. Watching how other people respond to particular situations, watching how other people mine their past and preserve their past, is useful information when I think about writing about other people. So, I get out of the service in May or June of 1967, basically unscathed, no basis for disability pension, and by this time, I didn't realize it then, but I certainly realize it now. My grandfather fought in the First World War, my father fought in the Second World War, I had fought in Vietnam, and one of my mantras for the last 10 years is that my children are now beyond draft age, and let's hope, and I frequently toast on this issue, that it's not that somebody else should do our fighting for us, but perhaps we can figure out a way that we don't do any fighting anyway. It's a good wish. So it's 1967. I got out of the service, I think, 17 days early. They wouldn't let me get out of going on active duty, but they let me out 17 days early so I could register for graduate school at UCLA. UCLA let me in on probation. I have to point that out. But within the end of the first semester, I had proven myself, getting A's and B's, and I loved being a fledgling historian. One of the intriguing things is that you go to a lecture and you don't understand a thing, but you're fascinated by the material, and you strive to be able to encompass that and have that same erudition and understanding of the past. Now, the important thing is later on in life is to figure out when you don't understand a thing, maybe there's nothing there to understand, and being able to distinguish between what you don't know won't hurt you and what you don't know might be useful. That's a challenging thing. but experience helps out on that. So I'm at UCLA. It's 1967, and I earned a master's degree and was working on doing my coursework for my PhD. And I landed on doing a topic on mid-19th century Burma. My advisor was a man named John S. Galbraith, a dour Scot from Scotland. We had the same birthday, November the 10th, a couple of decades apart. And he was very influential, a good mentor. And my wife is working full-time, bringing in the money. I am getting my GI Bill benefits. Every month a check comes in. And UCLA was a great place to be. It was very liberal. It wasn't as radical as Berkeley. It didn't have a free speech movement. It didn't have a Mario Savio. But it had sympathy pains for what was going on at the, I hate to use the word the main campus, but the original campus in Berkeley. Made a lot of friends in graduate school, and I've kept touch with some of them. Now, at this point, we've got to point out that there's some attrition along the way. We start to get reports of people from high school dying. Vietnam took a couple of people I knew fairly well in college, and some of my my teachers in graduate school pass away, and then some of my colleagues co-students in graduate school pass away. And observing this biology makes one not necessarily favor one's youth, but also gives one a sense that if one can keep one's health, one can continue to be productive. And the word productive, I said my father was a workaholic, and I am a workaholic as well. I think my father was a workaholic because he wanted to make life better for his children, and to do that he put in long hours and made money. I don't think he loved what he did. My father was a tool and die maker, a machinist, and if something was broken in the house, I mean, we had no power tools. There were no power drills and no power saws, nothing that you could plug in. He just didn't like to bring that sort of work home. For me, that's a sense that, and also he articulated that he left work at work and home was not to bring work home. My work as a historian, not so much as a lawyer, but as a historian, I don't separate between home and the university. In fact, the university doesn't have the best work environment. You teach there, but the research is done more comfortably in a basement like this, or spreading out to the office on the second floor, or taking over the dining room table, with chastisement from my wife, but toleration as well. So, going through graduate school, identifying a dissertation topic, and then planning a trip for a year to England. We had saved up money, we got some grants, and we left in late '69. I can remember the film Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy were just out, and they depicted some violence in America, and the Kent State Massacre, I think, is somewhere in this time period. It was, frankly, a relief to leave America in '69, '70 and go to England and read about the struggle in America, the Vietnam War, from some distance. And of course, getting my VA benefit check, GI Bill, while I'm in England. And American money went much further in England than it went in America. So we had a nice, comfortable time in England. I did my research at the British Museum, now called the British Library, at the India Office, and various archives in Scotland and other locations in England. My wife would tag along, and more than tag along, I Xerox machines really weren't that accessible back then. If you wanted to take notes, you either had to paraphrase or copy it verbatim, or verbatim may not be the right word. And Karen, I said, Karen, would you copy that page or copy that paragraph? And very obligingly, she copied it. And I still have those notes with her handwriting. And we're having a nice time going to plays, going to concerts, enjoying London. And Karen gets pregnant. You know, there's a sense of seriousness. You know, you're in England for a year, and now your wife is pregnant. Maybe you need a job. And I guess it was 1970, 1940. I was about 26, 27 years old. The job market in America was terrible for historians. There was a glut of historians. I've done some statistical analysis of how the production of PhDs in history respond to the need for teachers. The trouble is there's a need in year one, so 7 years later the PhDs come out and there's an oversupply. That was a problem. But you do what you like and you take your chances. One of my regrets or resentments about 2 years in the service is that, as I said, it sort of lost time, and if I had come out 2 years earlier, there would have been better jobs to pick from, to pluck from. In any case, what turned up was one fairly interesting job opportunity at the University of Rhodesia. And we were young. I said, you know, it sounds attractive, and it was attractive. Teach one class, have servants, housing provided, repatriation, leave. It was great. Noah was born in 70. I left my wife with a 7-day-old baby because I had to go off and teach. This is a familiar line in our lives. If I'm called to teach, I got to be there. It doesn't matter sometimes whether it's a funeral I have to go to, or a baby's 7 days old. I have to go teach. She came out when Noah was about 14 days old, and it's a long plane ride from London via the Azores to Johannesburg and then up to Salisbury. It was an exhausting plane ride, more exhausting for her than for me. We had our car shipped from London to Portuguese Mozambique, and we picked it up in Beira. We drove it to Zimbabwe, Rhodesia. And we had spent 3 years there, and it was a wonderful 3 years. My specialty was the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism, and that first job, teaching job, was in a country that was going through decolonization in a very tortured and unique fashion. I got tenure in 2 years. I think you just needed to be white and be able to talk, and you got tenure. It was a good school. The students were good, and the colleagues were good. I haven't really kept touch with Zimbabwe. I tried to stay somewhat authoritative for about 10 years afterwards, but without going back and revisiting. And as it's easier, well, okay. So I teach there for 3 years, and I know it's not a place to stay. Our child is about 3 years old, Noah, and the question is, do you want to raise a child, a white child, an expatriate child, born in London, raised in Rhodesia? Do you want this child brought up in this environment? Luxury, leisure tends to corrupt you. I think I was getting jaded or corrupted. And so we tried the job market back in America, and one job showed up, and one offer, well, one interview, and that was University of Nebraska at Omaha. And I flew into Epley Airport, probably May of 74, I think, and I got off the airplane, and I was struck by how hot and humid it was. I wilted almost immediately, and I said, this is just like Mozambique. And I haven't been proven wrong. been hot and humid. And I was interviewed, talked with the deans and the chancellors there, and my prospective colleagues. And I think that I had that opportunist or that chameleon in me. I had done that work, some work on a major African strike in 1948 in Rhodesia, and then I did a major work on, a major small work on African farmers creating unions, and both those articles were gobbled up by journals within a couple of weeks of their receiving it. So I knew I had my pulse on something that was hot, and with the journal's editing, it was presentable. So I was in the field of left-wing politics, labor politics, economic development. I had the ability to teach African history and British history, and they figured they were getting 2 professors for the price of $12,000, and I needed a job. So we arrived in America. And when we arrived back in America in 73, 74, my wife was pregnant again with our younger son, Aaron. I've got to tell you the tragic story of the Clintons now. I was born on the national health in 1943. My parents paid taxes, and the birth cost no money. My son Noah was born on the national health in London in 1970. We were just students from America living in England. No cost. My wife got 7 days in the hospital. Not because she was sick, but that's how long National Health gave a mother who had delivered a child, first child, 7 days in the hospital. It was luxury, I guess. That was a nice hospital, University Hospital, London. We arrive in Omaha. Karen is pregnant with Aaron. Pre-existing condition, not covered by insurance. Took us 3 years to pay it off, and that's after we had professional courtesy rates at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. So I'm a lifelong advocate, and the Clintons and the Democrats in 1993 attempted to introduce a health plan. The result, in part, was a Republican Congress in 1994. And be that as it may, we're in Omaha. We have a pre-existing condition. We're surviving on $12,000 a year. That's $1,000 a month. Buying a book that you wanted back then, you really had to really want it. But that also forced me to think somewhat entrepreneurially, and I got some editor-type jobs that I got royalties of other people doing the work. I did some writing that got me paid in addition to the university, and I taught summer school, which helped make ends meet. That takes us to the mid-1970s, and the children are going to school, and we sent them to the Jewish Day School. Before it was the Friedel Academy, it was joined with the Montessori School on Pacific, across from the Highland Country Club, now the Ironwood Club. And met some very nice people. There's a theory that the first people you meet in a town are the people that you might bond with for a long time. Karen and I are very interested in art, painting, sculpture, oils, waters, and we see something we like, we'll figure out a way to obtain it. If it's an anniversary or a birthday, we'll figure out that we can cadge our thoughts together and buy a painting. And so we came over from London in 73, 74. And I can never remember whether I came in 73 or 74. My wife's not here to ask me. She'll know right away. But I don't. There's certain things I can't remember, like my children's birthdays. And we brought a painting at the Royal Academy, which it's called Pollak, and it's in our entryway, and it came all rolled up, and we needed somebody to frame it. So the vice chancellor of the university back then was a Herbert Garfinkel, and his wife was an artist, and they directed us to Bob and Roberta Rogers, a place called Gallery 72, which was actually at 27th and Leavenworth. So we gave Bob and Roberta a call. This is probably in October, November of 74, shall we say. And we went over there and we showed them the painting, and he says, I can do a nice job for you. And he said, well, you do whatever you want. And he did it, and it hangs in our entryway. And we're having a dinner on August the 3rd, and Bob and Roberta are coming to dinner because one of their very close friends, Norman Geske, from the Sheldon Gallery, will be here. And so we've known Bob and Roberta since 74, and they're both well into their 80s now. It's the idea that you meet, some people you meet, you cherish, and it's, of course, I've done a lot of business at his gallery. Most of the paintings that I've purchased are from his place. And that map over there of Nebraska is framed in a old wooden door, and Bob took the door and scripted it down and made it into a frame, and he's got a touch for framing. So people like our children had friends, and their children's friends had parents like the Schwabs and the Skids and the Ricuses and the Rods, who moved away. And so from the mid to late 70s, we've kept touch with them, and by golly, they're all Jewish. And they're all, in a great part, at Bethel. And so we see ourselves being steered, not involuntarily steered, but steered by the parish we live in, and the neighborhood we live in, and the school we send our children to, and the synagogue, and the bar mitzvah ritual, and the wedding ritual, as these children get older. Both Noah and Aaron graduated from Millard North High School, and like many Jewish children, they did not want to stay in Omaha. Like many children, they didn't want to stay in Omaha. I mean, why should they stay in Omaha? Did their parents stay anywhere for very long? Well, as it turns out, we've been in, their parents, Noah, Aaron, Karen and myself, have been in Omaha now longer than we've lived anywhere else in our life. We've been here for 28 years, and Karen was born in Canada, I was born in England. We've lived in Ohio, California, Zimbabwe, London, and now Omaha, most of our lives, actually. Noah went to University of Kansas and graduated in 4 years. Aaron went to University of Wisconsin and graduated in 4 years. The first summers between their freshman and sophomore year, they spent the summer with us in Omaha. And that's the end of the story for that. Between sophomore and junior, and from the summer ever onward, they stayed in Lawrence or they stayed in Madison. And they did nicely in college. Noah was an archaeology and anthropology and psychology major or triple major. Aaron was a biology and zoology major. They both got little jobs, either at pizza parlors or cleaning out experimental monkey cages or working in libraries and reshelving books. But they didn't have any GI Bill to help them. They had their parents. And my wife will remind me every so often, that was 6 figures. And I said, yes, but they don't live with us anymore. Strike that. Anyway, they both moved to California. Noah was in the food industry for a while and found out that that wasn't a life that would lead very far. And he went back to school and got certified to be a teacher, did his student teaching in the Kansas City, Lawrence area, and then moved to Santa Rosa, California, and now teaches social studies in high school in Vallejo, California. quite happy there and loves teaching. For as much as he was disgruntled with high school, he turns out to be a high school teacher. It's ironic. And I've only taught high school maybe 2 hours in my life with high school students, and I can't handle it. Just it takes a different skill, different patience, different training. But he, my son Noah, I'm very pleased that he enjoys it and he's got the training and the skill. Aaron wanted to be a marine biologist, but didn't necessarily want to go on to the higher degrees to accomplish that. But he got as close as he ever wanted to get to the sea. He was a fish counter for some marine fisheries agency, and he worked on a fishing vessel out of Alaska. And when they found out that they had more counters than he needed, he took the first opportunity, if you will, to jump ship and get his plane ticket paid back to Seattle. And he says the high seas and the fishing industry is not for him. He apparently inherited the seasickness trait that I had. And now he, with his mother's assistant, they searched the web and they looked for jobs, and he found a job with an agency of Reuters called Venture One, where they identify who's providing capital for venture, for new businesses. His science background, his technology background gives him some ability to identify medical technology and computer, things I don't understand. And he's been working there at that job for 2 years and lives in San Francisco. And they're 25 and 30 years old, and they're single, and they're employed, and they have no women in their life. So take that as a message. Karen's biological clock is running. She wants to be a grandmother. And our preference, of course, would be that they find nice Jewish women. And they're working at it. Why they went to California, I've coined in the phrase, you can take the parents out of California, but you can't take California out of the children. A couple of, or 3 stories about my children. In 1989, the Jewish Federation put together a trip that went to Washington, D.C., a rally of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Jews from around the country in support of Soviet Jewry. And I went on that trip as a writer for the Jewish press, and the children went on that trip because they wanted to have young faces and children to have that experience. And it was a great experience. We flew out of Omaha in the morning, we went to the rally on the Mall, mingled with more Jews in one location outside of Israel than I can imagine, and then we came back on a chartered plane in the evening and took lots of pictures of the kids and the activities. That was, in a sense, a form of payback. My going into the service in 1961, in hindsight, I've interpreted as some sort of payback, patriotic for America, providing a haven. The trip in 1989 to Washington was to heighten my children's consciousness and to retain my consciousness about the importance of civil rights, human rights, especially for Jews in the Soviet Union. They spent summers in Israel with various USY and ARTSA programs. We went on a bicycle trip in Italy about 3 years ago. The boys, myself, Karen sagged us, and she took a taxi between our various starting and ending points. It was a very rigorous trip. I hadn't imagined that Italy was so hilly. And even though I was in pretty good shape, it was hilly. There are hills that even my children had to walk up. Well, Karen and I left Italy and went back to the States after a couple of weeks, and the boys stayed And they decided to go to Prague, Czechoslovakia, and they decided to go to Terezín, where their great-grandfather had been, and they decided to go to Hanover, where my grandfather, their great-grandfather, and my mother, their grandmother, Ruth, had lived. And they went to Vienna, where my father had lived. Well, they've been to places I haven't been to. I haven't been to Prague, I haven't been to Vienna, and I haven't been to Terezín, and they would not have gone there but for the fact that something in their education, something in what we did in the household, gave them a sense of gravity that took them there. Now, I gotta tell you, they didn't like going to Hanover. They found Hanover inhospitable. Vienna wasn't much better. They loved Prague, and they respected Terezín when they went there. But those are stories of what I consciously or unconsciously impressed upon them when they were youngsters, junior high school, middle school, high school, and college. They acted out when they were out of college themselves, and they traced the steps of an earlier generation. Now they're 25 and 30, and Karen and I are 14 days apart on the calendar, and we're both 57. And we travel a lot now. We've been to, last year we spent spring break in London and winter break in Paris. And this is July the 21st. And probably we'll go to Germany over winter break. I'm working on a biography of a man named Hans Roger Medal, who was born in Berlin in 1903, Jewish family who had become Christian Scientists. Medal was probably gay. He was a diplomat, wrote about a dozen books, especially biographies of dead and living royal family members. And he left a diary that's about 2,000 pages long, single-spaced, narrow margins, and typed. And apparently the handwritten diary is at the German Literature Archives in Marbach, Germany, near Stuttgart. And I want to go and look at those diaries, which run from 1927 to 1953. The trouble with the diaries, and I just go back to the book, Life a Year at the Sorbonne, is written in 6 languages: Swedish, French, German, Spanish, English, and Greek, some of which I can read and some of which I had translators. But in any case, all the languages when Elmo wrote were in conversational German, conversational French, conversational Spanish. Hans Roger Medal's diaries are in diplomatic French, diplomatic German, and English, much more difficult to read. Anyway, I met Medal in 1949, one of my early memories. We called him Elephant Uncle because he would take my arm and he would make like a itsy-witsy spider, but except this was an elephant. And my grandmother, Felix Bachmann's wife, my grandmother, was his housekeeper in Richmond. And she would prepare the food, make a nice house for when Medal would bring over ambassadors and consuls, because Medal, as a writer of royals, was also a major dealer in autographs, manuscripts, and rare books. He had an eye for that, and he would ghostwrite other diplomats' writing. And during the war, he specialized in small countries. That is, he would try to help Luxembourg, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the diplomatic officials who were in exile in London. He wrote a book called The League of London, which was about exiled politicians from countries that had been taken over by the Nazis. So he was a planner for post-war reconstruction, and he, in fact, became the editor of the United Nations Yearbook. So I've been fascinated by Medal for a long time, and his brother was a journalist who was vehemently anti-Nazi, and his brother was executed or died of natural causes, accelerated natural causes, in a German concentration camp. We're changing film. And to continue this Hans Roger Medal, when he was born, his name was Gerhard Solomon, but he changed his name. And since late 40s, early 50s, I have these early childhood recollections, and he died rather young in 1953, and he willed the house, the Hermitage in Richmond, to my grandmother, and some of his papers, letters, some of the documents that he would have otherwise sold have landed in my hands. And a couple of those letters I've been able to turn into articles because they were remarkable documents. But the challenge is to do a story on Gerhard Solomon, also known as Hans Roger Medal. And the main block in the story is there's so much material on him in his diaries, and that's usually a wonderful thing. I'm not turned off by that. The block is that I've got to read them in the language he wrote them, and it is tough. My wife urges me to do this. My realistic goal is to find a graduate student who wants to earn a PhD, who has command of French and German, and let them do it. Just as I was mentored at UCLA by John Galbraith, who turned over a topic to me that he thought would be intriguing and get me my, if you will, union card, my PhD, and it was a topic that, while John was interested in, it would not be something that he would get to in 2 or 3 lifetimes, but that's what students are for. Let them tease out the information. And I'm quite willing, graciously and with gratitude, to turn over the Hans Roger Medal material that I've acquired over the last 15 years to somebody else who has command of German and French. Part of the role of a teacher is not just to transmit what one knows or to transmit common facts, but to give people the opportunity to venture into areas where we don't know anything because nobody's put it together yet. I always urge my children, I've actually written with my boys articles, with Aaron, Noah so much, is to turn one's education, turn one's own reading, turn one's interest, turn one's experiences, and then create something new with it. And that's probably a good place to take a break or let you ask anything further, or things that stones we need to turn over.
Having heard the story of your story, really is what we wanted. Many places you've been, the things you did, and about your family also. What kind of message would you like to leave to the people at the Historical Society?
At the Historical Society, I learned this from Mary Fellman. Okay. Memorabilia, letters, photographs, documents, fragments from parents, grandparents, even great-grandparents. The Nebraska Historical Society is a wonderful place to keep documents that otherwise might get mislaid or even thrown away. Again, that book on Jewish life in Omaha and Lincoln, A Photographic History, is based almost 90% on photographs that were given by people to the Historical Society. At a third level of what's important for the Historical Society is people to step forward as volunteers to do work like Ben is doing here, identifying photographs, serving on the board, and serving as officers. I was a co-founder. I served as president for 1 year. My wife Karen has been treasurer, I don't know, 7 years. She's coming to an end any day now, and I'm looking forward to being able to make some call on the time that she would otherwise have given to the Historical Society to say, hey, Karen, I got some more stuff for you to proofread. Would you like to do some work with me? And finally, number 4 for the Historical Society is that it continues to create programs that keep historical sense of Jews in Nebraska and Jewish history and history generally alive through use of the materials in the archives, through public speakers coming in, and supporting projects like Memories, the publication Memories of the Jewish Midwest.
Finally, I'd like to give you a little time to leave a message for your boys. What would you like to say to them?
Keep the faith, baby. Keep the faith. That's an expression that comes from the late 1960s. It was more with a black pride movement with a clenched fist, keep the faith, baby. But in this day and age, for adult Jews living in a very cosmopolitan society, that you should not forget who you are and from where you came, because there's great value in that tradition and that training and that intellect that has been passed on to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our cat is named Quetzal, which is Yiddish for cat. Also, it could be named after Quetzal Levine,